Hello, I'm Dr. Jeffrey DeSarbo again, and hopefully you've watched the first NeuroSeries that we had about the introduction of this whole 14-episode NeuroSeries on eating disorders and the neuroscience and neurobiology of eating disorders. Again, just to refresh your mind, I'm a physician, a psychiatrist. I specialize in the treatment of eating disorders for the last 2 decades, and my special interest is in the field of the neuroscience of eating disorders. So in the NeuroSeries 2 here, we're going to go more into the neuroscience of some of the research, kind of give you the baseline of what the following 12 talks will be about and where all this information comes from. So basically, the baseline of this whole 14-part NeuroSeries is based on an understanding and kind of a translation and conceptualizing of the eating disorder research that has been out there. The thing is, there are a few journals that are specifically tailored for eating disorders, such as the International Journal of Eating Disorders, the European Eating Disorder Review, Eating and Weight Disorders. There's many journals on nutrition, but there's not that many journals compared to the number of articles that end up getting published in other types of medical journals. The problem is people who work with eating disorders may subscribe to journals such as the International Journal of Eating Disorders, and they get some of the research that's out there, but the vast majority of research is published in medical journals like the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Psychiatric Clinics of North America, the British Medical Journal, the Journal of Neurological Science, Brain and Behavior, just a vast number of journals across different specialties too, such as the Clinical Journal of Gastroenterology, Molecular Cellular Endocrinology, the Annals of Clinical Biochemistry, Internal Emergency Medicine. And there are thousands of articles published, but those who work in the field of eating disorders often do not have subscriptions. They're not reading these types of medical journals and science journals on a regular basis. So they do not get as much access to all the information that gets published on the scientific research with eating disorders. And over the past few decades, a lot of these articles that have come out have been super interesting because they're of our ability to use neuroimaging and the vast improvements technology-wise with neuroimaging studies. And that's what gets published in the research. Now, it's important with the eating disorder research that people know about this because it complements a lot of the psychological and therapeutic concepts and approaches that are used with patients with eating disorders. So it's important kind of that, clinicians, including therapists, nutritionists, kind of get exposure to we're learning more and more about the neurobiology of eating disorders. And if you take any individual article on its own, some of them have small numbers of participants, some have large numbers. And people in the past used to say, well, this doesn't prove anything, or this doesn't prove an eating disorder is biological. But because of the number of articles that have been published, we now have this complete body of evidence about the biological aspects of eating disorders. And what's been hard is some of these articles that get published are published in these peer-reviewed journals that are in very scientific, difficult to understand terms, and the information hasn't been translated kind of like in a usable form for your typical clinician, your therapist, your nutritionist, your medical doctor, your psychiatrist, in ways that they can take this information and find ways to use it when working with treatment plans and working with clients. And for patients, when you can translate this, kind of help them understand a little bit better what's going on in their brain, why their eating disorder is doing this or doing that, or why they think a certain way. It's a process of demystification. I actually call it demystification therapy for patients. It really informs the patients and gives them a little bit more of a sense of control about what's going on and more hope about what can be done when it's incorporated into a treatment plan. So, just to give everyone an idea, couple in 2019, I did a search in PubMed for articles related to anorexia nervosa, and just in 2 weeks in April of 19, there was 54 articles. So that just in 2 weeks, there's information out there. And I wrote on this slide just a list of some of the titles of the types of articles that are found. Some are very scientific and bioscience-based. Some are easier to understand and relate to recovery and therapeutics and different type of treatment approaches. But I always, like, a lot of times I'm supervising clinicians in training, and I tell them, look, if all you do is if you just go to and read abstracts, read two abstracts a day, you're going to read in the course of a year over 600 abstracts, and imagine how much information you'll have and be acquiring every year. So this is just 2 weeks in April for anorexia nervosa, 54 articles, and when I put in for bulimia nervosa 2 weeks in April, there was 16 articles, and here you can see like efficacy of psychotherapy and psychopharm therapies for bulimia, but here's another more scientific article, and this is all freely available on the internet through the government. And people need to be researching this information to better understand and talk with their patients, develop treatment plans, share it with families so that people can kind of develop an approach with an eating disorder that kind of, like I said, demystifies it and gives them some control of understanding what's going on with the body, with the brain, with the central nervous system. And when I talk about the central nervous system, this is what I'm talking about. A healthy central nervous system, it's electrical, chemical energy. There's neurons. Those little branches and arms are called dendrites. They all talk to each other. And, we have well over 100 billion neurons in our brain. And many of these brain regions get affected. And you can even see cellular volume changes, essentially mostly cellular volume loss that takes place with eating disorders. I always show this slide to a lot of patients of mine because I always say this is what you want your brain to be doing, firing off, having lots of energy, really neurons connecting with each other and communicating. But with an eating disorder, unfortunately, this is what happens. The cognitive functioning can slow down, both from a nutritional perspective and actually as a result of damages to different parts of the brain regions that are affected because of an eating disorder. There's also studies that look at the neurocortical synchronization, and they've showed that there's eating disorder-related mechanisms that are altered that control the synchronization of neuronal firing in the cortex of brains in people with eating disorders. In most of my slides, you will see that I do give an article as a reference or source for some of this information. For the purpose of this NeuroSeries, of course, I'm not going to go into the details of each article. I'm trying to give people a foundation and an understanding of some of the information that's out there biologically and from a neuroscience perspective. Same thing here. Brain-derived neurotropic factor is an important part of our body's normal functioning system. It's a neurotropin. It's a protein, essentially, that we manufacture all on our own. When somebody does have an eating disorder, such as anorexia and bulimia as well, when his body seems to stop producing as much brain-derived neurotropic factor that it needs. And what this protein essentially does is it protects all those dendrites. If you recall, I was showing, the healthy nerves firing off, and it becomes neurotoxic to the body of not having this BDNF. And like here in the first article I list here, that kind of shows that when someone has an eating disorder, that those BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor levels kind of change. When it's severe and somebody's been struggling for a while, you have very low levels of BDNF. When people start to recover, some of those levels come back, okay? So again, we're talking about neuronal health, and it's interesting sometimes because people, as a psychiatrist, sometimes with medications, I always say, most medications that we use will be more neuroprotective. And how does that work? It helps by kind of protecting the body, do things like not decrease its own production of brain-derived neurotropic factor, or help keep the body's own production of cortisol, which again can be neurotoxic, to minimal levels. Now, there's going to be many slides in this series as we move forward that kind of look like this. I just pull this one up and we'll come back to it when we talk about body image. But articles and research such as this one here help people understand concepts such as a drive for thinness. In these articles, the regions that are kind of circled there, and I'm not going to get into the technicality right now, but the regions, especially like in the parietal lobes of the brain, there seems to be a direct correlation between cellular volume loss in those regions and an individual's drive for thinness. Now again, this is an interesting article, but how can a clinician, how can a patient, or how can a family member kind of think about this information? I often talk about it like when someone goes into treatment, maybe like a residential center, and they'll restore weight. And most, for anorexia nervosa, they'll restore weight, they'll come out of the center, and most people end up thinking things like, I think they overshot my restoration. So they start to say, I'm just going to lose 5 pounds. That's it. Okay. But if an individual is prone to this type of a reaction from their eating disorder, that they start losing cellular volume in these regions, their drive, it won't stop at 5 pounds. Their drive will become stronger and stronger again. And it's a drive. That's what I was saying in the first NeuroSeries. It's not a choice. These are biological drives. Okay. And when we talk about the different regions, when one region, kind of like I said, with medical complications, how they can affect the brain. Well, one brain region can affect other brain regions because there's a whole processing that takes place when people are dealing with an eating disorder, processing what the meanings of food and weight and body image are, struggling with their internal dialogue with self-hatred or self-harm. And so one area fires off to another and they all communicate. Like I said, it's all electrical chemical energy, although in this diagram makes it look like there's this linear one region to another, where I always like to include this slide here, that it's kind of like our brain is bathed in these neurochemicals and the energy that comes from the electrochemistry part of it. And so there's this kind of like tidal and nebular flow to it. And so I just like to show this slide because it's not that one brain region is firing off and communicating in a direct linear fashion, in a direct linear function with another brain region. And then there's going to be studies where it shows like there's differences between even what type of an eating disorder an individual has and how that affects brain and brain functioning. Like in this study here, it kind of shows like, you have your left brain, your right brain, and with anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, these two regions are supposed to be communicating with each other, but they're different. They're affected in different ways in decreased functional connectivity. With anorexia nervosa, that's on the left-hand side. You can see the 3 regions there that seem to show decreased functional connectivity with the left and right side. And with bulimia nervosa, you can see the 2 regions in the frontal lobes that have decreased functional connectivity, again, with the left and right-hand side, and that's for bulimia nervosa. And there's this interplay between the right side and the left side of the brain that's fundamental for behavior, cognition, and emotional control. And so that's why you see a lot of problems, of course, with behaviors, cognition, and emotions, as I mentioned again in NeuroSeries 1. And it's when someone wonders why does somebody with an eating disorder demonstrate these types of patterns, these are the types of research that's being done that helps us better understand what's going on with that. Now, when it comes to things like serotonin, dopamine, BDNF, there's a ton of information out there and articles that are published that show like how the neurotransmitters and the receptors are different in individuals with eating disorders and individuals that do not have an eating disorder. And here's a list of some of those receptors, again, not going into detail for the purpose of this talk, but what I often want to show people is then you have these other types of receptors, histamine receptors, different dopamine receptors. There's several different types of dopamine receptors, tumor necrosis factor receptors. There's endocannabinoids that are different in people with eating disorders compared to non-eating disorders individuals. And then I go on to this slide that kind of says there's still all of these different types of receptors and neurotransmitters and neurohormones that are kind of have their get fingers pointed at for saying, well, these are some of the things that go wrong with eating disorders and disordered eating. And when you look at it, basically, there's so much involved. It's clearly a very complex issue. I like to show this in case somebody sees an article, hears an article, maybe there's something on Good Morning America or something where it says something like, tumor necrosis factor has been discovered to be a major cause of binge eating disorder. And then everyone starts thinking, well, there it is. That's what we have to kind of look at and worry about, or ghrelin or something like that. But it's a very complex interaction. And it's almost impossible to point the finger at any one type of change in receptors or neurohormones or neurohormones. One other thing about research is they also look at different parts of the brain that are affected, and for sometimes it helps with treatment. Like this is an example of an article that showed that if individuals get TMS, which is transcranial magnetic stimulation, to the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, that's what that region of the brain circled is, and they have a history of post-traumatic stress disorder and an eating disorder, that there's been significant improvement that takes place with treating that condition with interventions like TMS. And again, this is one sample, and it doesn't mean everyone's suited for something like that. But for the clinicians that are out there, this is one that was in the International Journal of Eating Disorders, and it gives people options when trying to handle difficult cases and developing a treatment plan. Now, some of the non-biological information out there is always important too, including the concept of recovery. This is basically a study that showed that with people with anorexia nervosa and others with bulimia nervosa had a 9-year follow-up, and at that 9-year follow-up, 31% were recovered with anorexia nervosa. At a 20-year follow-up, 62% were recovered, basically showing that sometimes people always are feeling like, well, I've had my eating disorder for so long, why bother at this point? And people sometimes want to give up, but what they don't really clarify is, with all of these people interviewed, what types of treatment they've all had. So, but some of the takeaway information is things like these additional findings here. Early recovery was associated with long-term recovery, and there's an argument against palliative care. I've seen cases of people essentially saying, they want legal rights to die when they've only had their eating disorder for 9-10 years. And this would be a study that says, listen, it doesn't mean it's never going to get better. And those who have a full recovery are twice as likely to not have any depression diagnosis, and those who have full recovery are 5 times less likely to not have a substance use disorder. So these are types of stats that go out there that sometimes the clinical team wants to keep in mind in discussing and educating patients and again, even families. Each clinician essentially needs to understand, of course, some basic concepts of neuroscience in the brain if they want to be on the cutting edge of eating disorder treatment. This was recently really driven home in Psychodynamic Psychiatry Journal in 2019 that clinicians need to start learning about and studying the neuroscience of eating disorders. And that's one of the reasons I love talking about this topic so much. And it's not just about an understanding of some of the changes that take place in the brain, but how you can use that information in treatments. And you can use that information by developing concepts that patients can understand. And for instance, even if I'm, let's say, using a certain medication with a patient, I can tell them why I'm using that medication based on some of the findings that have been done with the brain and the central nervous system and regions to target. And even therapy can target certain regions of the brain. And so it's important that people do understand that even if one is a traditional psychotherapist, an understanding of the neuroscience of eating disorders and the brain and how that changes in that brain affect the mind is important for what they do. And it's important to the patients as well, because, like I said, I've given this talk not just to clinicians, but to patients and their families. And it is something they so come to me afterwards with questions of interest and understanding and saying, I've never heard it that way. Thank you very much. And again, I think it has helped kind of change the course of treatment for many patients. Our next episode is going to be NeuroSeries 3, some of neurobiological findings with eating disorders. Again, changes that take place in the brain. We'll be discussing some of the concepts of an eating disorder being biologically based, which for the longest time people never looked at. They just thought it's a behavioral condition. Clearly it's not. As you remember, again, from NeuroSeries 1, the changes that take place neurobiologically bring about changes in psychology, changes in behavior, changes in medical concepts. So I'd like to essentially, again, thank everyone who's continuing to watch these. And if you haven't seen the first episode, please go back to NeuroSeries 1 so you see that as well. And just a reminder, if anybody does need any information, comments, if you want some information on the courses that we offer, just let us know. Here's some information. And I thank you very much for your time and attention.